Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. The work I will interpret for you in this issue is The Magic Mountain, a representative work by Nobel Prize laureate Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann is one of the most important novelists of 19th century Germany. Novels have never been a strong point of German literature. In the 18th century, Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther was the most famous novel in Germany. For nearly a century thereafter, no German novelist achieved the same level of success until the 19th century when Thomas Mann and another writer, Hermann Hesse, emerged. Therefore, to understand German literature, Thomas Mann is a literary peak that we must climb. Broadly speaking, Thomas Mann's novels can be classified as realism in terms of literary genre. His novels focus on detailed descriptions and strictly adhere to physical logic. In other words, you wouldn't expect characters in Thomas Mann's works to grow wings or transform into beetles. This writing style is influenced by Leo Tolstoy, the representative of critical realism in Russia, and Thomas Mann was deeply influenced by Tolstoy from his youth. However, unlike Tolstoy, Thomas Mann uses techniques such as symbolism and allegory in his novels, making them less realistic. In this sense, he is closer to the modernist style of depicting the inner world of characters through exaggerated methods. If you think of Kafka's novels and Picasso's paintings, you can probably understand what the modernist style feels like. The Magic Mountain is Thomas Mann's masterpiece, which combines both the realist and modernist styles. Understanding this point will provide you with the map to understanding this novel. The basic storyline of The Magic Mountain is the coming-of-age story of the protagonist, Hans. This story is very traditional and conforms to the realist style. However, aside from this main plot, the entire novel is more like a play. Most of the events take place in the same location and involve extensive dialogues. The conversations cover a wide range of topics, from medieval authoritative politics to Renaissance humanism, and from the Enlightenment's spirit of reason to Nietzsche's philosophy of the Übermensch. It discusses various significant issues in Western intellectual history, making it practically a European intellectual history. Therefore, Hans' growth is not the typical action-driven growth of a character who fights monsters and levels up, but rather a spiritual growth. It is precisely this inward exploration of the inner world that brings the novel closer to the modernist style. Thomas Mann's writing style may be related to the cultural tradition of the German nation, which emphasizes critical thinking and philosophical speculation. This naturally raises the threshold for reading his novels, causing many readers to hesitate. However, once you cross this threshold, the rewards you can gain, whether they are literary or beyond literature, will be exceptionally rich. Now, without further ado, let us step into the Magic Mountain and explore the scenery within. Part 1. A brief introduction to Thomas Mann and the genesis of the novel. First, let's get to know Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann was born on June 6, 1875, in Lübeck, a city in northern Germany. Lübeck had a strong commercial atmosphere, and Thomas Mann's father was a businessman. When Thomas Mann was 17 years old, his father passed away at a young age. The following year, he dropped out of school and ran away to Munich, where he secured an internship at an insurance company and began writing novels. Initially, his works did not receive much attention in literary circles. It wasn't until 1901, when his novel Buddenbrooks was published, that Thomas Mann started to generate heated discussions, receiving both praise and criticism. Some people admired the details and atmosphere in his novels, while others criticized him, labeling him a second-rate novelist. The renowned writer Stefan Zweig once commented that Thomas Mann's novels were long-winded and difficult to finish. Indeed, Thomas Mann had a penchant for writing massive works. His novels often exceeded thousands of pages, challenging readers' patience. There is a reason behind Thomas Mann's lengthy writing style. He was adept at incorporating his life experiences into his novels. The initial material for both Buddenbrooks and The Magic Mountain came from his personal experiences. Specifically, the inspiration for The Magic Mountain came from Thomas Mann's stay at a sanatorium. In 1912, Thomas Mann's wife fell ill and sought treatment in the Swiss mountains. He went up the mountain to visit her but ended up falling ill himself. The doctor advised him to stay at the sanatorium for half a year to recuperate. The following year, based on his experiences at the sanatorium, Thomas Mann began conceptualizing and planning a novel. Initially, his idea for The Magic Mountain was to explore the artist's perspective on beauty and death. However, the outbreak of World War I disrupted his train of thought. Only after the war ended did he resume the writing project, but by then, his conception of the novel had completely changed. The anguish of war and his reflections on it became woven into the fabric of the novel. This resulted in a drastic expansion of the novel's length, ultimately shaping the version we are familiar with today. Although The Magic Mountain is a lengthy work, its plot is not overly complex. The protagonist of the novel is named Hans Castorp. He was born into a wealthy merchant family in Hamburg but lost his parents at an early age and was raised by relatives. Here, we can see shades of Thomas Mann's own upbringing reflected in the story. To be continued in Part 2, an analysis of the first theme, how Hans discovers himself through desire and illness. After completing his education, Hans decides to pursue a career in shipbuilding as a naval engineer. However, just as he is about to embark on an internship at a shipyard, he unexpectedly falls ill. Before starting his new job, he plans to spend 3 weeks at a sanatorium in the Swiss mountains and visit his cousin, who has been staying there for 5 months. On a Tuesday in August, Hans arrives at the Berghof Sanatorium and checks into room 34. The Magic Mountain referred to in the novel's title is this place. This section serves as the prologue of the novel, where Thomas Mann takes his own experience of visiting his wife and modifies it slightly to create this part of the story. The fundamental style of the novel is also evident in this section. Firstly, there is an emphasis on precise, and sometimes even obsessive detail. As mentioned earlier, Thomas Mann was deeply influenced by Tolstoy and had a fondness for detailed descriptions, presenting various aspects of things through precise portrayals. For example, in the novel's 3rd chapter, he devotes an entire chapter to describing Hans' first day on the mountain, providing detailed descriptions of the layout of the dining room, the types of food, the manner and time of reclining, and the route for walks. Secondly, right from the start, the novel exudes an epic grandeur. In epics, the hero's birth and character often determine their destiny, and Thomas Mann aims to create this feeling for the readers. He attempts to make readers believe that he has already revealed Hans' fate, while describing his family and character. Part 2. It is important to note that in epics, the hero's character and thoughts are already established upon their introduction. However, Hans is different. He is a growing hero. His life at the sanatorium is a process of receiving intellectual education and then maturing. This setting stems from a tradition in German literature known as Bildungsroman or novel of education, which focuses on the intellectual and moral growth of the protagonist. This tradition can be traced back to Goethe's novel Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. The defining characteristic of this type of novel is its weak narrative plot, with the author deliberately downplaying the dramatic elements and placing the emphasis on the protagonist's daily life and the impact of these experiences on their intellectual development. Let's make a comparison. Wilhelm Meister's growth, as depicted by Goethe, occurs during his wanderings in the world, where he gains a deeper understanding of real life through direct experience. Therefore, Wilhelm Meister's growth relies on direct experience. In contrast, Hans' growth takes place within the sanatorium, where he is instilled with a comprehensive understanding of Western intellectual history, forming his perception of real life. Thus, Hans' growth relies on indirect experience. So, how does Hans grow through indirect experience? Let's continue to delve deeper. Hans' life at the sanatorium begins with the dining room. There are a total of 7 tables in the dining room. Although there are no strict rules, everyone defaults to sitting in their assigned seat. Between the 2 breakfasts, they are required to observe strict bed rest and have their temperature measured, which takes a full 7 minutes each time. The number 7 appears repeatedly throughout the novel, including the number of dining tables and the number of temperature measurements, among many other instances. In Western culture, 7 is a number with special significance, as it symbolizes life, morality, history, and culture, a complete process from nothingness to existence and back to nothingness. At the sanatorium, patients are served 5 meals a day, with each meal offering not only a large quantity of food but also a variety of choices. Although all the residents are patients, their appetites seem particularly vigorous. Hans, who has just arrived at the mountain, finds it difficult to adapt to everything. He gets drunk easily from the wine, and even the cigars he usually enjoys smoking don't taste right. What he finds most unbearable is the sound of the dining room door being slammed by a Russian woman named Frau Chowchat during meal times. Hans eagerly awaits the end of the 3-week period, longing to leave the mountain on schedule. There are 2 doctors at the sanatorium. The chief physician is nicknamed Lodovico Settembrini, and the assistant physician is nicknamed Nafta. Both nicknames come from the names of judges in Greek mythology who preside over the underworld. It was the idea of a senior patient named Settembrini, an Italian writer and a staunch advocate of humanism and Enlightenment rationality. Settembrini is known in the sanatorium for his love of debate and satire. He also has a nickname, the Italian Satan. Soon, Hans and Settembrini become friends. Hans enjoys conversing with Settembrini, and they frequently discuss abstract philosophical topics. These conversations stimulate Hans and prompt him to continuously ponder the meaning of life. Settembrini is able to provide guidance and advice to Hans on all matters. It is evident that he seeks to influence this young and inexperienced individual, and have him accept his own values. Hans gradually becomes accustomed to life on the mountain, and the taste of cigars returns to normal. Only Frau Chowchat and the sound of her slamming the door continue to bother Hans, causing him a subtle sense of unease. One morning after breakfast, instead of observing bed rest as required, Hans goes for a walk alone. When he returns, he feels physically uncomfortable and mentally disoriented. He recalls a boy he had a secret crush on during his youth, whose eyes are exactly like Frau Chowchat's. Hans realizes that his particular attention to Frau Chowchat is not because of her rudeness and brashness but because she arouses repressed desires within him. It turns out that Hans has a tendency towards same-sex attraction, and he has been suppressing this inclination. In fact, Thomas Mann himself was a repressed homosexual. Therefore, Hans' complex emotions towards Frau Chowchat can be seen as a confession of sorts by Thomas Mann himself. After Hans becomes aware of his suppressed desires, the assistant doctor delivers a lecture on the relationship between desire and illness. The lecture states that repressed desires manifest themselves in the form of diseases. It suddenly dawns on Hans why the patients at the sanatorium engage in illicit affairs and become jealous. Their diseases are connected to their suppressed desires. This realization leads to a new understanding of the sanatorium and of himself. Additionally, the assistant doctor fails to mention that repressed desires can also transform into another form of appetite, hunger. At this point, you naturally realize why Thomas Mann devoted so much attention to describing the dining room and the food in the earlier parts of the novel. Hans' stay at the sanatorium is about to come to an end, but on the eve of his departure, he develops a fever and is diagnosed with tuberculosis. This is an example of repressed desires manifesting as a disease. After the diagnosis, Hans transitions from being a visitor to being a patient, and his attention towards Frau Chowchat intensifies. Frau Chowchat's close interactions with other men ignite jealousy within him. Discussions about Frau Chowchat during meals become a daily routine for Hans. He notices that whenever he becomes emotionally aroused, his body temperature rises, as if his body is eagerly proving the hidden connection between illness and desire. However, Hans' feelings for Frau Chowchat remain in the realm of infatuation. Apart from exchanging greetings when they meet, they have little conversation. Most of Hans' time is spent in bed rest, taking walks, and engaging in conversations with Settembrini. The various events happening around him prompt Hans to contemplate significant questions about the body, life, and illness. One day, the chief physician diagnoses the lesions in Hans' lungs through an X-ray. The modern technology of X-ray deeply impresses Hans. It is worth noting that the novel takes place before World War I, when X-ray machines were rare, and few people had the opportunity to come into contact with them. Hans believes that X-rays reveal the fundamental essence of human life on a physiological level. This sensation further stimulates him to explore the human body from the perspectives of physiology and medicine. Consequently, his understanding of life undergoes further changes. From this point on, he begins voluntarily visiting critically ill patients at the sanatorium. He seeks to understand life not only from the perspective of vitality, but also from the perspective of death. In the blink of an eye, it is February of the following year, and the annual carnival is approaching. This will be Hans' first carnival on the mountain, marking 7 months since his arrival. Over this period of time, his relationship with Frau Chauchat has finally made some progress, and they become friends. On the night of the carnival, under the pretense of borrowing a pencil, Hans confesses his feelings to Frau Chauchat. The act of borrowing a pencil carries profound significance because the only conversation Hans had with the boy he secretly admired during his youth was also about borrowing a pencil. Hans' repressed desires finally erupt. At this point, it becomes difficult to distinguish whether his desires are directed towards Frau Chauchat or the boy he once infatuated with during his youth. After the carnival, Frau Chauchat left the sanatorium, marking the end of the first part of the novel. In this section, there are numerous details and lengthy dialogues, with underlying clues to Hans' self-exploration process. Hans fell ill due to repressed desires, and through his illness, he began questioning the essence of life on a physiological level. As his reflections deepened, he turned his gaze towards the meaning of death and ultimately discovered that the body, love, and death are inherently interconnected. They are all expressions and vehicles of self-consciousness. Reflecting on these aspects ultimately leads back to questioning subjectivity, such as who am I? And why am I who I am? These abstract metaphysical questions arise. In this context, it is evident that Thomas Mann drew inspiration from Freudian psychology and also recognized Nietzsche's influence. Nietzsche was perhaps the first philosopher to affirm the value of illness. In his view, without illness, healthy individuals cannot attain self-consciousness. Just as without death, life becomes meaningless. Part 3. Let us continue with the second half of the novel. After Frau Chauchat's departure, Hans' desires cooled down, and his body temperature returned to normal. Shortly afterward, Settembrini also left the sanatorium and moved down the mountain to live. Hans' exploration entered a new stage, expanding from the realm of self to the world. He began ordering books related to botany, and engaged in solitary reading during the periods of rest. One day, while taking a walk with his cousin, Hans unexpectedly encountered Settembrini and his roommate. Hans noticed that these two individuals presented contrasting states in various aspects. In terms of appearance, Settembrini dressed modestly but exuded elegance, while the roommate dressed extravagantly but displayed an obscure and cold demeanor. In terms of personality, Settembrini was sincere and passionate, whereas his roommate was selfish and indifferent. Regarding their ideologies, Settembrini was a staunch and idealistic rationalist who advocated liberalism and democracy, while his roommate adhered to absolutism, disregarded individual freedoms and rights, and was willing to sacrifice ordinary lives for a political purpose without any moral guilt. You may have also sensed that these two characters symbolized the two main ideological currents in Europe at that time. Settembrini represents the humanistic thought, Enlightenment rationalism, and democratic politics that emerged since the Renaissance, while his roommate inherits medieval authoritarian politics and incorporates elements of Nietzsche's Superman philosophy, resisting Enlightenment rationalism and democratic politics. In reality, Thomas Mann's own thoughts align closely with Settembrini, defending liberalism and democracy. However, in the novel, Hans' stance becomes more ambiguous. He is both attracted to Settembrini's views and interested in his roommate's perspectives. Hans occasionally visits their dwelling, takes walks with them, and engages in debates, attempting to discern his own views on the self, life, and the world. Soon, in August, Hans had been living on the mountain for a whole year. At this point, Hans' cousin couldn't suppress his desire to pursue a career and, disregarding the doctor's objections, he resolutely left the sanatorium to return to the military. In contrast, Hans, although granted permission to leave, decided to stay. Neither Settembrini's advice nor his uncle's visit could shake his determination. He chose to stay, partly to wait for Frau Chauchat's return and partly because he wanted to continue exploring himself and the world. After winter arrived, Hans became obsessed with skiing. During one skiing trip, he encountered a snowstorm and got lost in the blizzard. He became mentally disoriented and even had strange dreams. In his dreams, Settembrini and his roommate engaged in intense debates. He also dreamed of entering a temple where a horrifying scene of children being eaten unfolded. Through these dreams, Hans gained a clearer understanding of himself and human society. He realized that Settembrini's roommate was licentious and wicked, while Settembrini himself only played the rational horn and lacked initiative. The scene of children being eaten in the temple metaphorically represented the collapse of order and moral decadence. In the third year of August, Hans completed 2 years on the mountain. His cousin's old illness recurred, and he returned to the sanatorium. Unfortunately, he was diagnosed with laryngeal tuberculosis and passed away by the end of the year. His cousin's death symbolized the unprecedented challenges faced by upright, pragmatic, and honor-loving German military personnel and the spirit of the German nation. Interestingly, with the cousin's death, the markers of time in the novel also disappeared. When Hans first arrived on the mountain, the narrative pace was very slow, with the entire third chapter describing only his first day there. As Hans adapted to life in the sanatorium, the narrative pace gradually quickened. The fourth chapter covered the first 3 weeks, and in the fifth chapter, the time span was further extended, covering the months from the third week to February of the following year. The sixth chapter covered the period from February of the second year to August of the third year, a full year and a half. The final chapter had the longest time span, starting from August of the third year and continuing until Hans left the mountain, totaling 5 years. We can observe a pattern: the duller Hans' perception of the external world, the faster time passed, and the quicker the narrative pace became. Why did Thomas Mann arrange it this way? One line in the novel might provide an answer: story and life, both are inseparable from time. This viewpoint bears some similarity to the concept of time by French philosopher Henri Bergson in the 19th century. According to Bergson, time is not just a quantification of space but also a form for individuals to explore themselves and life. Therefore, an instant could also be eternal. Marcel Proust incorporated this concept into his novel In Search of Lost Time with the iconic scene of eating the Madeleine cake. Thomas Mann also drew inspiration from this idea. In his view, time exists only when people explore the essence of life. Rather than being a quantification of space, time is a quantification of reason and consciousness. During this period, Frau Chauchat finally returned. She brought along her friend, a wealthy coffee magnate from the Netherlands. This stout figure with thinning hair liked to speak grandiosely but often struggled to express himself clearly. However, he possessed a regal aura that differed from how Hans treated the other pursuers of Frau Chauchat. In this Dutch gentleman, Hans discovered the qualities he lacked. However, this extraordinary figure suddenly committed suicide. Afterward, Frau Chauchat left the mountain again, and Hans became numb to life. He visited Settembrini and his roommate less and stopped studying books on physiology, medicine, and botany. He even gave up his passion for skiing. He either indulged in music, seeking solace in abstract art, or believed in mediums, experiencing the difference between life and death through superstition and mystery. The atmosphere in the entire sanatorium grew increasingly frenzied, and Settembrini and his roommate engaged in a duel over their differing views. Hans witnessed the entire duel process. Settembrini, in defense of his humanitarian ideals and rational spirit, even fired his gun into the air. However, his roommate failed to put his Superman philosophy and disregard for individual life into practice. Instead of aiming the gun at Settembrini, he turned it on himself. Soon after, World War I broke out, and the sanatorium was also affected. Hans left the mountain to enlist and was blown up by a bomb during a march. His exploration of life and the world came to an end, and both his physical and mental suffering disappeared. The story concludes here. Finally, I'd like you to ponder a question. Why did Hans only leave the sanatorium when World War I arrived? Clearly, Thomas Mann's sanatorium, like Kafka's castle, is an allegory. The sanatorium represents the entire Europe, encompassing its history, religion, culture, and reality. Hans received education and self-discovery in the sanatorium, undergoing physical, intellectual, and spiritual tribulations and baptisms. This is not just his personal experience, but a microcosm of an entire generation of European youth. Therefore, unless all of Europe is shaken, experiencing enormous changes that cause the old world and old order to crumble, how could young people like Hans leave the sanatorium? In this perspective, Hans' story is not only about the coming of age of a German youth but also an allegory about the state of European youth in the 20th century. Conclusion. The Magic Mountain was published in 1924. When Thomas Mann received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1929, his acceptance speech praised his great novel, Buddenbrooks, The Decline of a Family, and made no mention of the Magic Mountain. However, as time passed, the classic status of the Magic Mountain became increasingly solidified. Scholars' appreciation of it even showed a trend surpassing that of Buddenbrooks. Today, it is impossible to discuss Thomas Mann without mentioning the Magic Mountain. It is like a book that the author wrote ahead of its time, intended for future readers. In the novel, Thomas Mann discusses profound philosophical questions, challenges the prevailing moral stance of the time, and confronts the existential predicament of humanity, ensuring its enduring place in the spiritual landscape of human history. In the final lines of the novel, Thomas Mann writes, "From this burning enthusiasm beneath the dark, rainy night sky, will love ever emerge?" Hans cannot be certain whether love can arise under the dark sky. He undergoes a long journey of thought but still fails to discover the truth of life and the world. What does the evolution of thought and culture, the development of science and technology truly signify? What is their purpose? How can individuals understand themselves? Where will the future of humanity lead? Throughout the entire novel, these questions are constantly asked. They are the questions posed by Thomas Mann, who experienced the aftermath of World War I, to all of Europe and even to human civilization. Neither he nor Hans, nor their contemporaries, ever found the answers. These questions are left for the readers of the Magic Mountain to contemplate. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.